It was almost difficult to spend a year in London after school or studies had finished where I grew up. It was like an unofficial rite of passage. So that's what I did. I went to London. And I started to have a good time there. And then after some time in London, many months, I went and sat by the Thames one day and had a strange experience. It was like some kind of a voice or a command, maybe, that I had to go to India. I haven't had anything quite like that since. It seemed like there were many things I should do and many things that I was expected to do, but I had to go to India. Many years later, when I read Joseph Campbell about a call to adventure, I thought about that time on the Thames. It was like something fateful broke through. And you know, when I read James Hillman's book, The Soul's Code, he said, sooner or later, something will call you. It was like some kind of experience like that of being called to India. And one of the first things that happened when I arrived there was that a man came up to me on the street and said, "Excuse me, sir, what have you been thinking about God?" And that shook me up from the start. There is a culture shock when you first go to India. No one had ever asked me that question before. Usually in my normal world, people ask, "What do you do for a living?" Or maybe, "How much money do you make?" And there I was in India, and there were cows on the street. And there were so many bright colors. And there were temples to different goddesses and gods, and people making offerings to them. There was incense. And I was thinking maybe I'm hallucinating. Either that or everyone in India was taking hallucinogenics. It was an unfamiliar world. And someone told me of a temple in the north of India where if you gave your time and date of birth, they could give you a copy of your Akashic records. And someone else told me about another temple where there were monks who stood on only one foot. By now, I had realized that I had really wandered out of my familiar world and into an unusual world. And it had seemed like a good idea at the time, but in retrospect, I was thinking maybe I should have stayed in London and watched the cricket on TV. I had somehow been led by a strange voice into an unknown land, and India was challenging my view of the world. And it wasn't quite like the normal modern secular world where I lived. And there were so many different gods and goddesses: Kali, Brahma, Vishnu, Shankar. And I don't think it's possible to come to India and come back quite the same. A friend said to me that many people go spiritual after they go to India because they've ridden in the back of a Mumbai taxi. And I knew what he meant. When you're faced with your own mortality like that, it does seem to push you more towards spirituality. But the religious symbols of Christianity have never really spoken to me that much. And some of the symbols of India did. I was taken by the symbol of Nataraj, the dancing Shiva. I liked the sense of the cosmic dance, or that dance in the fire of creation. Many years later, I read this by Heinrich Zimmer in his book, Myths and Symbols in Indian Art and Civilization. And this is just a little of what he said, but to me, it says so much about India. Nataraja, king of dancers. Dancing is an ancient form of magic. The dancer becomes amplified into a being endowed with supranormal powers. The personality is transformed. Like yoga, the dance induces trance, ecstasy, and experience of the divine, the realization of one's own secret nature, and finally, mergence into the divine essence. In India, consequently, the dances flourish side by side with the terrific austerities of the meditation grove, fasting, breathing exercises, absolute introversion. To work magic, to put enchantment upon others, one first has to put enchantments on oneself. And this is affected as well by the dance as by prayer, fasting, and meditation. Shiva, therefore, the arch yogi of the gods, is necessarily also the master of the dance. And after some time in Mumbai, and not that long after arriving in India, I went up to the mountain into the Aravalli Ranges in Rajasthan to learn about Raj Yoga. There were very few Westerners there, and it was like entering into a special world. It felt something like stumbling across a Shangri-La or a lost community of yogis. And this one was overlooking the Rajasthani desert. When I first got there, I met a friend, Arjun, and we started walking to Nucky Lake and back in the mornings. But what was another culture shock for me is he started holding my hand as we walked and swinging it just like I was his girlfriend. And then sometimes he fondled my hand if he felt extra close. And I could feel myself tensing up a little. And then I started having a cross-cultural argument with myself. But Arjun was a beautiful person with a wonderful innocence. And I thought, I have to go with this. And who knows, one day I might even get to like it. But it felt like boundary crossing. And I was really hoping that no one was taking any photographs of any of this, because if it ever got out, I could never go back to the Claremont Football Club or to Western Australia. But I don't want you to get the wrong impression. He's a lovely person, Arjun. And I think that's maybe one thing that's good about traveling. Maybe it says, you know, that in Australia, we've been very affected by the English, and they're a bit weird and repressed when it comes to touch and things like that. And maybe one thing from traveling is that you see what's normal in one place is so different in another. And I think in India at that time, it wasn't appropriate for young males to spend time with young single women, but there were displays of affection between males through touch. One day on one of our walks, I saw a questionable property called the Sheraton Hotel. They just added an E. And it wasn't quite like any other of the Sheraton properties I had seen before. It only had about 4 rooms. And usually in the Sheraton hotels, they had much better lobbies than that. Anyway, it was probably better not to think about it too much. Another time I saw 2 men who had carried pails of milk up to the top of Mount Abu from the village further down the mountain. And they decided to have a sleep in the middle of the road just around the corner of a bend. And they'd taken off their turbans and then laid them out, and they were sleeping on them. And when cars came around the corner, they had to swerve to miraculously miss them. And I was thinking, that's probably not the best place to sleep. These days, I might say that's a very right brain thing to do. But at the time, it seemed like one of the secrets of settling into India is that you have to realize that there's some kind of secret hidden order in the chaos. And then I met Surya, who ran the kitchen. Surya means the sun. He'd been a university lecturer or a scholar or something like that. And now he was the head cook. And I started speaking with him for many hours about everything to do with yoga and meditation. He was a wonderful teacher. You know, sometimes people say that they had a teacher at school, or they met a teacher that had a big influence on them. And Surya had such a huge influence on me. There are different kinds of yoga, he said. Bhakti yoga is a devotional yoga, a yoga of love, love and devotion maybe. Karma yoga is a yoga of action. Then there's Gyan yoga for the people that are into the knowledge of yoga. We spent hours and hours in that kitchen talking about things. One day he just looked at me and he said, "You, psychology." I think what he was trying to say is that that was my area. Anyway, at the time, it was very significant for me. Slowly, I began to realize there's a whole language for the inner world in India, and a whole language for the soul and the sacred. The early morning meditation was called Amrit Vela, the time of nectar. Sometimes it was called the Brahm Murat, the time of the very beginning. Just the way people greet each other. Namaste, I bow to the light within you. And I started to have many experiences in meditation. And in a way, it was like a taste for the superbia of the spirit, or the exaltation of the spirit. It was something like being on top of the mountain with the world below. And India started to take a place in my heart, and I began to see India more like the Great Mother. Nowhere in the world is there better sunrises and sunsets than in India. And I started to get a feeling for the ancient wisdom of Bharat. Many years later, I heard Stan Groff call it a technology of the sacred. So that's what I might say. There's a technology of the sacred that in India that's been handed down through the centuries. And Carl Jung said sometimes the sacred can show up in the most unusual places and where you least expect. And that is what happened to me in India. The sacred was showing up where I least expected. Anyway, I try not to sentimentalize India too much. But after some of the initial culture shock had worn off and I started to sink into it, I started to love India. And it's true, I would say, that it's not possible to go to India and then come back exactly the same person.